The Forgotten Soldier. The first chill of winter had crept into Ridgeville, the kind that gnawed through layers of clothing and settled deep into bones already worn thin by time and memory. Alexander Cole sat slumped on a bench at the edge of Memorial Park, his breath visible, shallow, as he clutched the frayed straps of his duffel bag, the only thing he had left in the world that still bore his name. Once, this man had stood tall in battle-scarred deserts with a rifle in his hands and orders ringing in his ears. A sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, forged in the fires of Fallujah, Kandahar, and every other forsaken corner where the world forgot its humanity. They called him Ironheart back then, the man who never cracked, never wept, never wavered. But now, there was no iron left, only a quiet, weathered shell draped in second-hand clothes and silence. He didn't speak much anymore. Not because he couldn't, but because words had begun to feel like a luxury, like clean socks or warm meals. And to whom would he speak? The city moved around him like a ghost unaware of its own death. People passed him on the sidewalk without a glance, their faces lit up by phone screens, never noticing the man with eyes like broken bayonets. Alexander had once had a home, a modest house painted blue, just off Juniper Lane. That home had a porch swing, and the soft laughter of his wife, Elise, echoed in its wood panels. She was the one who used to wait up for him, who bandaged his hands after nightmares made him punch the walls in his sleep. Elise, the one thing the war couldn't take from him, until it did. They told him it was a routine operation, a complication, an unfortunate side effect. But the truth lay buried under red tape and bureaucratic apathy, a misfiled prescription, a delayed diagnosis at a VA hospital whose walls reeked of mildew and indifference. When Elise died, something inside Alexander crumbled in silence. Not like a tower, but like a flag, folding quietly, respectfully, in the dark. He sold the house a week after her funeral. Not because he needed the money, though eventually he would, but because every corner held a memory sharpened like shrapnel. He donated every cent to a local animal rescue, where Elise used to volunteer. Her smile had always been brightest when surrounded by those creatures no one else wanted. In giving everything away, he thought he might give himself a chance to start over, or at least to disappear cleanly. But grief doesn't allow for clean exits. It clings. It festers. And the world is not kind to those who return from war only to find another battlefield waiting, one without honor, without clarity, without allies. His PTSD flared like a bad radio signal, and his benefits, the ones promised with flags and speeches, had stopped arriving after an error in his service file. A glitch, they called it. A glitch that meant no medication, no therapy, no roof. He drifted. From shelter to shelter, then to no shelter at all. Some nights he wrapped himself in tarps beneath the overpass and counted the cars by their engine tones, a game he used to play with Elise. Other nights he didn't sleep at all, watching instead for shadows that never quite stayed still. In his breast pocket, tucked in plastic wrap, he kept two things: a crumpled photo of Elise taken on the day he deployed and a weathered military ID. Most days, he forgot who he had been. But when he touched that card, when his fingers grazed the indent of his name beside the faded emblem of the Marine Corps, a flicker of self returned. Not pride, not yet, but memory. And sometimes memory was all a man had. It was hunger that finally broke him, the kind that burned deeper than frostbite, that echoed in hollowness no war had prepared him for. And it would be that hunger, not the war, not the grief, not the silence, that would lead him to crime. Not yet. Not today. But the seed was there, growing, quietly, like winter in the marrow. A crime of desperation. The hunger had grown into something more than a physical pain. It had become a voice, quiet, persistent, almost gentle in its cruelty. A whisper that lived beneath Alexander's ribs and spoke only when the world went still. You will not survive this winter. He tried to ignore it. Tried, for weeks, to keep what little dignity remained. He had stood at the back entrances of bakeries, eyes lowered, voice hoarse with shame, asking only for day-old bread. Most of the time, he was ignored. Sometimes he was told to leave. Once, someone threw a cup of coffee at his feet, cold and already drained of hope, like him. He thought often of Elise during those days. Of how she'd curl her fingers around his wrist when he spiraled, how her eyes never once flinched from the brokenness in him. She would have hated to see him like this. Or maybe, she would have wept for him. Either way, the thought gutted him. And so he spoke to her in silence, every night beneath the overpass, lips trembling without sound. She was the only one who still listened. It happened on a Thursday. The sky was the color of old bruises, and snow threatened in the air, not falling yet, but circling like a predator. Alexander hadn't eaten in nearly 3 days. His stomach was no longer growling, it had surrendered. There was a trembling in his hands he could no longer control, and the last pair of socks he owned had holes big enough to see his frostbitten toes. That morning, he passed by a small corner store. Glass front, warm yellow light, the scent of frying meat drifting onto the street like a dream.
He didn't go in.
Not then. Just stood across the road, watching the people inside. A mother with a child. A man picking out cigarettes. The cashier, young, chewing gum, tapping her nails on the counter without rhythm. Ordinary moments that belonged to a world he had been exiled from. He sat on a crate in the alley nearby for nearly an hour. Thinking. Not planning, thinking. That was the difference. Planning would have implied control. He had none. Only hunger. Only fear. Only that voice again, now louder. You are dying, and no one cares. When he stood, it wasn't with resolve. It was with surrender. He entered the store with his hood up, eyes glassy, face hollow like a worn-out carving. The cashier glanced up and went back to her gum. He shuffled through the aisles, touching nothing at first. But the moment came, quick and trembling. He grabbed a pack of protein bars. A sandwich. A bottle of water. He turned to leave. The girl's voice stopped him. Hey, you gotta pay for that. Alexander froze. In that instant, something inside him fractured. Not from anger. Not from panic. From shame. A deep, searing, impossible shame. He turned, not knowing why, and before he realized what his hands were doing, he'd drawn the box cutter he used to cut cardboard in the shelter's back lot. He hadn't even remembered putting it in his coat that morning. Just let me go, he said, voice shaking, eyes wide with a grief too large for the room. The cashier's eyes widened. No scream. Just a terrified silence. She backed away slowly, hands raised. Alexander backed toward the door, every breath a knife. He hadn't meant for this. He hadn't wanted fear. He wanted food. He wanted warmth. He wanted to be someone else, anyone else. The bell above the door rang as he exited, and the street swallowed him whole. He didn't run. He just walked. Down the alley, past dumpsters and rusted pipes, until he could no longer see the store. Until he collapsed behind a set of trash bins and ripped open the sandwich with trembling fingers. He devoured it in seconds, barely chewing, gagging on his own hunger. When it was gone, he sat still, staring at the wrapper in his hands like it had betrayed him. And then he began to cry. Not loudly. Not the kind of sobbing that demanded to be heard, but the kind that leaked out slow and bitter, like rot from a wound. He pressed his face into his sleeve, ashamed even of his own tears. That night, sleep didn't come. He sat upright against the alley wall, body shaking, eyes wide. Every footstep sounded like sirens. Every voice became an accusation. He hadn't hurt anyone. He hadn't wanted to. But he had crossed a line. And the worst part wasn't fear of arrest. It was the knowledge that something inside him, something Elise once loved, had gone dark. The man who had once charged into gunfire to protect his unit had now drawn a blade on a child behind a cash register. The war had not ended. It had only changed its weapons. He was no longer just lost. He was dangerous. And he knew, deep down, that something irreversible had begun. The seed had sprouted. And somewhere, far off in the night, the wind howled like a mourning mother, grieving for a man the world had forgotten, and who had now begun to forget himself. The reunion in the cold room. The room was no more than 12 feet across, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb that gave everything a sickly pallor. There was no furniture, only a rusted metal chair in the corner and a fold-out cot with a paper-thin mattress. The walls were bare concrete, stained in places with mildew, and the kind of memories that stick to surfaces long after people forget. The air smelled faintly of old sweat and something sharper, like bleach failing to hide the scent of despair. Alexander sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. His hands were locked together, knuckles white, not from cold, but from something older, habit, maybe. The posture of a man who no longer knew how to defend himself from his own mind. The knock came soft, barely audible. He didn't look up until the door creaked open. She entered quietly, her footsteps unsure on the cement, the sound like breath on glass. She was thinner than he remembered, and her eyes held something brittle, something that hadn't been there before. The years had changed her, but it wasn't just age. It was loss. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes flickered. She didn't respond immediately, just looked at him, long and full of something that trembled between grief and fury. She hadn't seen him in 5 years, not since the funeral, not since Elise's casket had been lowered into the frozen earth, and he had stood there, numb and useless, unable to speak. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, finally. "You shouldn't have come at all," she replied. Her voice was cold, but her hands were shaking. He nodded. There was no argument in him. "I know." She crossed the room slowly and leaned against the opposite wall, arms wrapped around herself as though holding her ribs together. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence pressed down like snowfall, gentle at first, then smothering. "You look like hell," she said at last. "I feel worse." She scoffed, and for a second he almost thought she would laugh. But her face remained hard. "You're bleeding," she added. He looked down. A scab on his forearm had split open. He hadn't noticed. "It's nothing. Everything's nothing with you. That was always the problem." He flinched, but said nothing. "I read the police report," she continued. "The store. The girl. I didn't hurt her. But you could have." He nodded. "Yes." Elena's eyes filled then, but she refused to blink. She was 16, Alex. Just 16. "I know. And Elise, she would've." Her voice broke, and she turned away, pressing a fist to her mouth. She would have hated this. He swallowed hard. His throat was raw, like he'd been screaming in dreams he couldn't remember. "I still talk to her," he murmured. Elena turned slowly to face him again. "That's not comforting." "I know." There was another silence. Not empty, never empty, but heavy with the weight of all the things they weren't ready to say. The memories neither of them could escape. Elise's laughter in the kitchen. Her fingers stained with oil paint. The way she had danced barefoot in the garden when the first spring rain came. "She believed in you," Elena said at last, softer now. "More than anyone. I didn't deserve it. You didn't." But that never stopped her. He looked at her then, really looked. Not just at the shape of her face or the weary lines around her eyes, but at the hurt she carried like armor. The way grief had turned her into a fortress. "I didn't come here to ask forgiveness," he said. "I came because I didn't want to die alone." She blinked, startled by the rawness of it. He hadn't meant to say it, but it was the truth. And there it was in her face. A crack. A breath. A moment where something shifted, even if only a little. "You're not staying," she said, voice tight. "Not for long. One night. That's all I can give you." He nodded. "That's more than I deserve." She walked past him then, toward the small table by the cot. Placed something on it. A thermos. He hadn't even noticed she'd brought it in. "Soup," she said. "Still warm." He didn't thank her. Couldn't. Not yet. But when she turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind her, he held the thermos in his hands like it was a relic. Something holy. Something human. And for the first time in weeks, he let the tears come. Not for himself. Not for the crime. Not even for Elise. but for the small mercy of being remembered by someone who still carried his ghost and still, against all reason, opened the door. A forgotten history, a shattered dream. The dream always came just before waking, like a cruel reminder of something he no longer owned. In it, Alexander stood in the ruins of a chapel, its wooden beams cracked and blackened, its stained glass windows shattered into kaleidoscopes of loss. But in the dream, he didn't see the destruction. Only her, Elise, in that red dress she wore on their first real night together, dancing barefoot across the broken floor, arms open, as if forgiveness could be caught like light. But in the waking world, memory was less forgiving. The soup Elena had left him the night before was cold now, untouched. Alexander sat hunched beside the empty cot, the thermos between his knees, hands wrapped around it as if trying to warm his bones with the ghost of something kind. He hadn't slept. Or maybe he had, briefly, badly. He couldn't tell anymore where sleep ended and guilt began. The morning light filtering through the barred window above him was gray, washed out, like diluted ash. Outside, the city was waking. Engines coughed. Someone cursed in the alley. The world moved on. But Alexander remained still, trapped in a tangle of memories too sharp to touch, too familiar to ignore. The past had become a house he couldn't leave. Every door opened to a different regret. In the mirror above the rusted sink, he barely recognized the man who stared back, cheekbones too pronounced, beard unkempt, eyes sunken as if time itself had carved them hollow. He looked like someone who had been forgotten even by his own reflection. And perhaps he had. Because somewhere along the line, between Elise's death and the guilt that followed, he had ceased to be anyone worth remembering. Years ago, he dreamed of something different. A home not marked by grief, but by color and warmth and the kind of peace that whispers instead of screams. Elise had painted it for him once, in a letter she wrote but never sent. He'd found it in her journal, weeks after she was gone. "I don't want to change the world," she wrote. "I just want to live in one where you come home and put your arms around me without needing a reason. That would be enough." Alexander had clutched that page in shaking hands, the ink smudged by salt, and realized, too late, that he had never understood what home really meant. He'd been chasing something larger, something louder. The war, the deployments, the adrenaline of being useful, needed. And all the while, Elise had been there, waiting in quiet rooms with candles half-burned and dinners gone cold, carrying his absence like a second skin. He rose slowly, legs aching from disuse, and pulled on the threadbare coat Elena had thrown over the chair. It still smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender, laced with something sharper, more bitter. Maybe grief had a scent. Maybe it clung to things longer than people did. The alley behind Elena's building was quiet. Snow from the night before still clung to the edges, dirty and packed down. He walked aimlessly at first, hands in pockets, breath clouding the morning. But his feet knew where they were going before he did. It took him 2 buses and a half-mile on foot to reach the old library on Ashwood Street. It was boarded up now, a casualty of funding cuts and neglect. But to him, it was a mausoleum of memory. Elise had worked here, loved this place with a quiet devotion. It was where she had taken him the first time he confessed the nightmares. The screaming, the flashes of sand and blood, and children with glassy eyes. "You're not broken," she had whispered in the stacks. "You're just tired. Let me carry some of it." But he never let her. Not really. He had buried it instead. Deep. Too deep. The lock was broken. It had been for years. He slipped inside, past the brittle do not enter tape, and into the hollow belly of what once was sacred to her. Dust blanketed everything. Books, shelves, counters, like a forgotten snowfall. He sat on the floor beside the children's section, in the same corner Elise used to read to local kids every Thursday afternoon. The mural she had painted, an open book blooming into a tree, was still there. Faded. Cracked. But still there. Like her. And for the first time in days, he let the silence in. Fully. Without trying to fill it. Without fighting it. It was heavy. But it was hers. It was history. His history. A dream once whole, now torn. But even in the ruin, there was something sacred. Something real. He closed his eyes and whispered her name, not as a prayer, not as a plea, but as a remembering. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. Whether the law would catch up to him. Whether Elena would shut him out for good. Whether he would ever forgive himself. But for now, in the stillness of the place she once loved, Alexander let the past speak. Not to condemn him, but to remind him that he had once been capable of more. And maybe, just maybe, he could be again. Restored honor. The courtroom rises. The courtroom was old, its architecture speaking of another era. Mahogany benches worn smooth by decades of use. Tall windows letting in reluctant light through narrow slits. The room was still, solemn, heavy with breath held too long. The kind of silence that didn't invite peace, but reckoning. Alexander stood at the defendant's table, shoulders squared not in defiance, but exhaustion. His suit didn't quite fit, borrowed from a local shelter's outreach program. His tie was uneven, trembling at his throat like a noose he'd tied himself.
But his eyes had changed.
They were clear now, not free of sorrow, but no longer drowning in it. To his left sat his lawyer, a soft-spoken veteran named Greaves who had offered to take the case pro bono after reading about Alexander's military history and the incident that had unraveled it all. Greaves was old school, stoic, sharp, and kind in a way most people never noticed until much later. He hadn't made promises, only said, "You tell the truth. All of it. Let the world decide." And that's what Alexander had done. He'd told the court about Elise, about the war, about the clinic where he'd volunteered after her death, trying to stitch together the broken parts of himself by helping others worse off. He spoke of the robbery, how it wasn't about the money, not really, but a moment of collapse. A cry for something to stop the bleeding inside him. He didn't excuse it, didn't ask for pity, only understanding. The prosecutor had been merciless, reminding the jury of the trauma inflicted on the store clerk, the risk, the gun. She painted him as a man who'd snapped, who'd turned his past into justification for present harm. But the character witnesses, oh, they had come. And they changed the air in the room. Elena was the first. Her voice didn't waver. She looked straight at the jury when she said, "He failed himself, not the world. He has carried that failure like a cross for years." Then came the store clerk, the same girl from that winter night, now composed, confident. "He apologized to me," she said. "Not just in court. Weeks after, he found me. I'd never seen someone look so ashamed, or so determined to make it right." Finally, it was Greaves who closed the defense. His words were few. "There is justice," he said, "and then there is mercy. Sometimes they walk together." Now, the judge's voice rang out across the room, deep and unwavering. In light of the testimony, the defendant's mental health history, his continued service to others since the incident, and the absence of malice or injury in the offense, this court finds Mr. Alexander Reese guilty of unlawful possession of a weapon, but suspends the sentence under condition of psychiatric supervision and continued community service. "You are free to go." The gavel fell. A single strike. Then silence. It didn't erupt, not right away. There was no applause, no cheers. Just a collective breath, the kind that fills a space like a blessing. And then someone stood. It was Elena. In the back row, beside the stained glass window. She stood slowly, hands folded in front of her. Her eyes met his. Not warm. Not yet. But steady. Others rose too. One by one. Strangers. Veterans. Former patients from the clinic. People who knew him not by name, but by the quiet ways he had tried to repair what he'd broken. Alexander didn't move at first. Couldn't. His legs felt foreign, like they'd been borrowed from a man who hadn't carried the weight he had. But then he stood, too. Not out of pride. Out of gratitude. Out of awe that somehow, the world had chosen to see him as more than his worst day. He turned to Elena, and this time he nodded. Not in thanks. Not in apology, but in acknowledgement of the pain, of the distance, of the truth. Outside, The day was cold but clear, the sky wide and washed with winter sun. He didn't know what would come next.
There were still debts to pay.
Still nights that would bring the dream of Elise in that red dress. But something had shifted. He was not redeemed, not healed, but seen. And sometimes that was where redemption began. The light at the end of the road. Winter receded slowly that year, like a reluctant grief finally releasing its grip on the bones of the city. The ice melted in fits and starts, leaving behind puddles that reflected not just the sky, but the subtle rebirth of everything beneath it. Alexander Reese now lived in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the river. The apartment was modest, the kind of place you could forget the world in. A worn desk by the window. A chair that creaked under memory. Walls still bare, except for one photo, a grainy image of a woman in a red dress, mid-laugh, eyes filled with a kind of joy that no longer belonged to this world.
Elise.
The court ruling had given him a second chance, but it was Elena's letter, delivered a month later, written in the same neat, deliberate handwriting he remembered from their childhood, that gave him something else, the beginning of forgiveness. She hadn't said much in court, but her letter, it was everything. Alex, it began, I've tried to write this 100 times. There were moments I hated you, and others where I missed you so fiercely it hurt. I think what broke me most was that you disappeared, not just from the family but from yourself. You gave up. I understand it now. Maybe too late. But I do. She told him about her own grief, how it had hardened her, how she had used it to build walls she didn't know how to take down. How their parents never stopped setting a place for him at the table, just in case. How she'd spent years wondering if she'd done enough to save him. But then, in her letter, a single line stood out like a flare in darkness. Sometimes the road back isn't a path, but a person. I think I'm ready to walk beside you again. He had read that sentence 1,000 times. And now, on a Sunday morning, he folded the letter one last time and placed it in his coat pocket. He had somewhere to be. The sun filtered through the city like a promise, cutting through the remnants of frost and shadow. As he walked, he passed a young couple helping their toddler up from a fall. The child cried, then laughed, brushing off her scraped hands. The world, he realized, kept offering itself again and again, messy, broken, beautiful. He arrived at the cafe early. It was a quiet place, wooden counters, the smell of citrus and fresh bread. And there she was sitting near the back. Elena. She stood when she saw him. No tears. No theatrics. Just two people, broken by the same war, trying to find each other on the far side of the silence. They didn't speak right away. Instead, he sat. She poured his coffee. Her hands were still steady. His were not. I got your letter, he said finally. I know. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he didn't see the girl he had abandoned, nor the woman shaped by the shards he'd left behind. He saw his sister, still standing. I'm not fixed, he said. I don't think I ever will be. That's not what I came for, she replied. I came to see if there was still light in you. He hesitated, then offered a faint smile. There is. Not much, but some. They sat in silence, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't empty. It was whole, honest, shared. Later, as they walked by the river, she took his arm, not out of necessity, but choice. And when a street musician began to play a violin nearby, something unspoken passed between them. There was no grand redemption, no sudden joy, but the path ahead was no longer solitary. Alexander looked out over the water, the sun warm on his face. The wind carried the scent of spring, of beginnings. And for the first time in years, he did not dread the road ahead. Because now it held light. And someone to walk beside him.